The thick forests of Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri were supposed to be a sanctuary for Claire Peterson, a writer recovering from a shattering breakup. She craved the solitude, the whisper of leaves, and the timeless allure of nature. It wasn't just an escape, it was research. Claire had spent months poring over books on Ozark folklore, fascinated by the tales of witches, spirits, and lost souls that haunted these woods. But as she drove her RV into the dense wilderness, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. She set up camp in a secluded clearing, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was perfect, or so she thought. The first 2 days were uneventful, spent exploring trails and filling her notebook with ideas for her new book. Every so often she'd stumble across strange markings etched into tree bark, spirals, crude faces, and symbols she didn't recognize. Instead of feeling threatened, she found them intriguing, evidence of the very stories she was trying to unearth. On the third morning, a knock on the RV door startled her. A man in a khaki uniform stood outside, his face weathered and eyes sharp. "Park ranger," he introduced himself. "Name's Travis. You here alone?" Claire nodded. "Just doing some writing." Travis frowned, his gaze lingering on the RV. "Most people don't stay here by themselves. These woods, they have a way of getting into your head." Claire forced a smile. "I'm fine. I like the quiet." "Quiet's not the only thing out here," he said, his tone darkening. "If you see anything strange, you leave. Don't wait. Don't think about it, just go." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and walked off, disappearing into the trees. His words lingered in her mind, a shadow of unease creeping in despite her efforts to dismiss it. That night, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The familiar symphony of chirping crickets and rustling leaves had vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence. Claire sat by the fire pretending to read, but her eyes kept darting toward the darkness beyond the flickering flames. It wasn't long before she heard it, a faint, rhythmic knocking. It started at the rear of the RV, then moved to the side, slow and deliberate. Her breath hitched. "It's just the wind," she whispered, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Summoning her courage, she threw open the door and shone the beam into the night. Nothing. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight, but the unease didn't leave. Claire retreated inside, locking the door and drawing the blinds. Sleep came reluctantly, haunted by dreams of shadows stretching toward her, whispering her name. The next morning, she found something etched into the side of her RV. 3 crude symbols carved deep into the metal. They matched the markings she'd seen on the trees, but now they felt like a warning. Claire couldn't shake the chill in her spine as she traced the symbols carved into her RV. The grooves were deep, as though gouged by claws, not tools. She ran her fingers along the jagged edges, her mind racing with questions. Who or what had done this? The forest seemed to press closer, its towering trees like silent sentinels guarding a secret they refused to share. Determined to uncover the truth, Claire grabbed her notebook and set off on a trail she hadn't explored before. Her steps crunched against the leaf-strewn path, the weight of her boots the only sound in the unnervingly still air. She marked her route with bright orange flags tied to branches, ensuring she wouldn't get lost in the labyrinth of trees. The sun filtered weakly through the dense canopy, casting fractured shadows that danced and shifted like living things. An hour into her hike, she came across more symbols carved into tree trunks. These were larger, more elaborate, with jagged lines radiating out like spiderwebs. Claire sketched them in her notebook, her hands trembling despite the calm she tried to maintain. These carvings felt purposeful, almost ritualistic, as if they were part of some ancient language. The deeper she ventured, the more frequent and intricate the markings became, some even smeared with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The forest began to change. The air grew thicker, heavier, as though it was resisting her presence. Claire paused, catching her breath, and realized the trail had disappeared beneath a layer of gnarled roots and moss. She turned to retrace her steps but froze. The orange flags she tied to guide her back were gone. Her pulse quickened. She spun in place, searching for any sign of the path, but the forest seemed to shift around her. Trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at the sky, and the silence pressed against her ears like a scream she couldn't hear. "Hello?" she called out, her voice sounding small and hollow. The forest didn't answer. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves. But they grew louder, weaving through the air in a language she couldn't understand. Claire's heart pounded as she gripped her flashlight, swinging the beam wildly through the shadows. The light caught something, a figure darting between the trees. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. There was no reply, only the whispers, rising and falling like a chant. Panic clawed at her chest as she stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a root. Suddenly, the forest erupted with sound. A low, guttural growl came from somewhere behind her, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Claire didn't wait. She ran, her breath ragged, her legs burning as she pushed through the dense underbrush. The whispers followed her, circling, as if the forest itself was alive and determined to keep her from leaving. Claire burst into the clearing where her RV was parked, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it and leaning against it, as if her weight. The forest beyond was still, almost serene, but she knew better now. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. She couldn't stop thinking about the figure she'd glimpsed in the woods, a dark shape that seemed to flicker in and out of sight like smoke caught in a breeze. She had been so sure it wasn't her imagination. Yet now, as she peered out into the darkness, doubt began to creep in. Maybe the forest's eerie stillness was simply playing tricks on her mind. Or maybe she wasn't alone. As the hours dragged on, Claire tried to distract herself, burying her face in her notebook and writing furiously. But the words came haltingly, her sentences broken by the weight of her unease. Each creak of the RV felt amplified, every gust of wind scraping against its walls sent shivers down her spine. Then came the knocking. At first it was faint, 3 deliberate taps against the RV's side. Claire froze, her pen slipping from her fingers. The sound came again, this time from the rear. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the random thud of a branch or the scrape of an animal. It was intentional. Her breath quickened. She grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely louder than a whisper. No answer. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down like a physical weight. Claire swallowed hard and reached for the door handle, her heart hammering in her chest. Against her better judgment, she yanked it open and aimed her flashlight into the night. Nothing. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. The trees stood silent, their gnarled branches unmoving in the still air. But then she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, where the shadows were deepest, a figure stood motionless. It was tall and indistinct, its edges blurred like smoke, yet its presence was unmistakable. 2 hollow, glowing eyes stared back at her, unblinking. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure tilted its head, as if studying her. The flashlight shook in her trembling hands. "What do you want?" she croaked, her voice cracking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, its gaze fixed on her. Then, slowly, it raised an arm, its long fingers pointing toward the forest behind it. A cold dread washed over Claire. The message was clear. It wanted her to. She slammed the door shut, locking it and stumbling backward. The RV seemed to groan in protest as the air around it grew heavy, suffocating. From outside, the whispers began again, louder this time, circling the RV like a predator closing in on its prey. The whispers grew louder, swelling to an almost deafening cacophony that seemed to seep through the walls of the RV. Claire clutched her flashlight like a lifeline, her pulse hammering in her ears. The figure outside was gone, but its presence lingered, a weight pressing down on her chest. She paced the small confines of the RV, every shadow in the corners now seeming alive, every creak of the floorboards an omen. And then, the scratching began. It was subtle at first, a faint scrape along the RV's side, like nails dragging across metal. Claire froze, her stomach knotting as the sound traveled, moving steadily along the wall toward the door. She stumbled backward, tripping over the small coffee table, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever was outside was trying to claw its way in. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, grabbing the flashlight and aiming its beam toward the door. But the noise didn't stop. If anything, it seemed to respond to her fear, intensifying with each shaky breath she took. Claire's mind raced. Travis's warning echoed in her head. "If you see anything strange, you leave. Don't wait. Don't think about it. Just go." She cursed herself for staying, for not taking his advice seriously. Whatever was out there wasn't going to let her go without a fight. The RV groaned, shuddering as if something massive was pressing against it. The lights flickered, dimming until only the flashlight illuminated the space around her. Claire's gaze darted to the windows, her heart plummeting. The shadows outside were moving, stretching unnaturally across the clearing, twisting and curling like smoke caught in a storm. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as though something, or someone, was trying to force it open. Claire scrambled to her feet, her back pressed against the far wall. She grabbed the only thing within reach, a small kitchen knife, and held it out in front of her, her hands trembling. The whispers stopped. The scratching ceased. The silence that followed was worse, thick and suffocating, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. And then the knocking returned. 3 loud, deliberate knocks. Claire's throat tightened as the RV seemed to darken around her. She inched toward the door, her knuckles white around the knife's handle. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her ears straining to catch the slightest sound. She was met with silence. Gathering every ounce of courage, she reached for the blinds and pulled them back. A face stared back at her. It wasn't human. Its features were blurred and undefined, as if its skin were made of smoke. The hollow eyes, glowing faintly, bore into hers with an intensity that froze her in place. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure grinned, a jagged, impossible smile that stretched far too wide, before vanishing into the shadows. From the depths of the forest, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They weren't just calling, they were commanding. And Claire realized with dawning horror that she might not have a choice but to obey. Claire's hands shook as she backed away from the window, the knife slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The whispers outside had grown to a fever pitch, circling the RV like a storm of voices, each overlapping in a chilling, incomprehensible chant. Her chest tightened, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She couldn't stay here, not with it waiting outside. The knocking resumed, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of the RV's door handle twisting. Claire's mind screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The forest itself felt alive, conspiring to keep her trapped. The whispers were inside her head now, each syllable clawing at her sanity, urging her to come. And then it stopped. Silence, heavy and absolute. Claire froze, her ears straining for the next sound, but none came. The oppressive quiet made the pounding of her heart deafening. She crept toward the door, her bare feet brushing against the cold floor, and peeked through the small peephole. The clearing was empty again, bathed in pale moonlight, but the shadows beyond the tree line seemed to pulse, alive, and watching against her. Better judgment, Claire grabbed her flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped outside. The cool night air hit her like a wave, carrying with it the earthy scent of moss and decay. The forest stood in stark contrast to the stillness of the clearing, its darkness deep and impenetrable. Yet something about it called to her. "Why are you doing this to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The response wasn't spoken, it was felt. A deep, unrelenting pressure in her chest that seemed to pull her toward the tree line. The shadows shifted, parting to reveal a faint trail, one that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a path she wanted to follow, but she felt no choice. The forest had decided for her. Claire moved forward, her steps slow and hesitant. Every crack of a twig beneath her feet made her flinch, and the flashlight's beam flickered erratically, as if resisting her attempts to illuminate the way. The carvings on the trees grew more frequent, more intricate, their twisted lines seeming to writhe as her light passed over them. Her pulse quickened as she noticed something else. The air had grown colder, each breath visible in a thin plume of mist. The ground beneath her feet turned soft, like wet earth, and the faintest scent of rot tickled her nose. Then she saw it, a figure standing motionless in the middle of the path. It was the same shadowy being she'd seen earlier, but now it seemed more solid, more real. Its head tilted slightly, as if curious about her approach. In its hand, it held something small and glinting, a chain with a charm dangling. "Take it," a voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't human. It was deep, layered, and resonated like the groan of old wood. Claire's knees threatened to buckle as she inched closer. When her trembling hand reached for the charm, the figure whispered, "Now you belong to us." Claire stumbled back as the charm dropped into her hand. It was cold, unnaturally so, and pulsed faintly as if alive. The shadowy figure didn't move, but its presence loomed heavy, an oppressive force that made her legs feel like they would give out beneath her. The whispered words, "now you belong to us," reverberated in her mind, chilling her to the core. Her flashlight flickered violently, and then went dark. Claire was plunged into complete blackness, the moonlight seemingly swallowed by the forest. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent now, forming words she couldn't understand but felt in her very bones. The charm grew warmer in her palm, almost burning, but when she tried to drop it, her fingers wouldn't obey. It was as though it had fused to her skin. Panic surged, and Claire turned to run. She didn't care where, she just needed to get away from it. But the forest wasn't letting her go. The trail she had followed was gone, replaced by an endless maze of gnarled trees and twisted roots. Every direction looked the same, and the deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she tripped over a root, falling hard onto her knees. The flashlight tumbled from her grasp, rolling into the underbrush. She scrambled for it, but the beam sputtered back to life on its own, illuminating the forest floor. Her blood ran cold. Carved into the ground beneath her were symbols, just like the ones she had seen on the trees and her RV. But these were fresh, the edges jagged and damp as if they had been etched moments ago. In the center of the largest symbol was a single word, Claire. Her stomach churned. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, this isn't real." But the forest offered no reassurance. The whispers became a roar, drowning out her thoughts, and the air grew suffocating. A low growl rose from somewhere behind her, deep and guttural, sending a shiver up her spine. Slowly she turned her head. The figure was there, standing just a few feet away, its smoky form more defined now. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and its hand reached out toward her, impossibly long fingers curling as if to beckon her closer. Claire scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough earth. "Stay away!" she screamed, holding up the charm as if it were a shield. To her surprise, the figure hesitated, its hand recoiling slightly. The charm in her palm flared with a blinding white light, cutting through the oppressive darkness like a knife. The figure let out a sound, a guttural screech that wasn't entirely human, and dissolved into the shadows. But the reprieve was short-lived. The light from the charm faded, and the whispers returned, now filled with anger. The forest wasn't done with her yet. The charm's fading light left Claire in suffocating darkness once more. The air around her felt alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy that pressed against her skin. She could feel the forest watching her, its unseen eyes lurking in every shadow. The whispers weren't just noise anymore. They carried meaning, each guttural syllable sinking into her mind like claws. "Leave. Stay. Ours. Always." Claire clutched the charm, its warmth now a faint thrum in her palm, barely offering any sense of protection. She staggered to her feet, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and fear. Her flashlight flickered weakly, the beam cutting through the dense fog that seemed to rise from the ground. She had no direction, no plan, just the primal need to escape. She pressed forward, the path twisting unnaturally, leading her deeper into the forest no matter which way she turned. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal hands to snag her hair and clothes. She pushed past them, ignoring the sharp scrapes against her skin, when a sudden sound froze her in place. Footsteps. They weren't hers. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, they crunched the leaves, just behind her. Claire whipped around, the flashlight shaking in her grasp, but the beam revealed nothing but the path she had already taken. Her heart thundered as the footsteps grew louder, circling her now. "Who's there?" she cried, her voice cracking. The forest answered with silence, and then tap, tap, tap. The rhythmic sound came from all directions, echoing through the trees. It wasn't just knocking this time. It was a heartbeat, a pulse that matched the erratic thudding in her chest. Claire stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, when the whispers returned, louder than before. "This way." The voice was clearer now, slithering through her mind like a parasite. It wasn't asking, it was commanding. Her legs moved before she realized it, her body no longer entirely her own. She tried to resist, planting her feet, but the force was irresistible, dragging her deeper into the labyrinth of trees. Ahead the fog parted, revealing a clearing bathed in pale, sickly light. At its center stood a massive tree, its twisted branches reaching skyward like a grotesque monument. The ground around it was scarred with symbols, each one glowing faintly in the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of decay. And the whispers were deafening now, an overlapping cacophony of voices that pulled her forward. At the base of the tree, a figure knelt, its back to her. Claire froze, the charm burning in her hand again, as though warning her not to get closer. The figure shifted, rising slowly, and turned toward her. It was her. Or at least, it looked like her. The face was pale and gaunt, the eyes hollow and filled with a haunting emptiness. The doppelganger's lips curled into a grotesque smile as it raised a hand, mirroring her grip on the charm. "You're already mine," it whispered. Claire's breath hitched as she stared at the figure that wore her face. It was her, yet it wasn't. The hollow eyes, stretched smile, and sunken features gave it an unnatural, grotesque appearance, as if her reflection had been twisted by something ancient and cruel. The whispers around her quieted for the first time, as if even the forest was holding its breath. The figure tilted its head, studying her with an unsettling calm. It raised its hand again, mimicking the way Claire clutched the charm. She felt a jolt of cold radiate through her body, a sensation that made her knees tremble. Her fingers tightened around the charm instinctively. "You don't belong here," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. The doppelganger stepped closer, its movements fluid yet wrong, like a marionette on tangled strings. With each step, the glow of the carvings around the tree intensified, bathing the clearing in an eerie, pulsating light. The air grew colder, sharper, and the sickly scent of decay became overpowering. The figure stopped just a few feet from her, its smile widening until it seemed to split its face in two. When it spoke, its voice wasn't a voice at all. It was the forest itself, the whispers condensed into a single, overwhelming presence. "I am what waits," it said, the words vibrating in the very ground beneath her feet. "I am what takes." Claire stumbled back, her eyes darting around the clearing for an escape, but the forest loomed like a wall, its trees twisting together to block every path. She was trapped. Her grip on the charm tightened as it pulsed with a faint warmth, the only barrier between her and the thing that had taken her form. "You don't have to fight," it continued, its voice now a soft, mocking imitation of her own. "You're already here. You always were." "No," Claire hissed, shaking her head. "I'm not yours." The figure's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold amusement. It stretched out a hand, long and clawed, reaching toward her. The charm in her hand flared, burning against her palm, and the figure recoiled, letting out a guttural growl that echoed through the clearing. "You think that will save you?" It sneered, its voice layered with malice. "It's only a matter of time. This place doesn't let go." The carvings on the ground began to shift, their lines twisting into new shapes, forming a circle that pulsed with light. The ground beneath Claire trembled, and the whispers returned, louder, more urgent, chanting words she couldn't understand. The figure lunged, its clawed hand outstretched. Claire screamed, holding the charm high. A burst of light erupted from it, momentarily blinding her. The doppelganger let out a shriek, its form dissolving into smoke. But the light faded just as quickly, and the whispers surged, now filled with rage. The ground beneath her cracked, and Claire realized with a sickening dread. She wasn't escaping. The forest wasn't done. It was never going to let her go. The ground beneath Claire gave way with a sickening lurch, and she fell to her knees, her hands instinctively clutching the trembling earth. The glow from the carvings around the tree intensified, casting grotesque shadows that danced and twisted in the fog. The whispers were deafening now, a maddening cacophony of anger and triumph, as if the forest itself was closing in for the kill. Claire's vision blurred as the charm in her hand grew unbearably hot, its once reassuring warmth now searing her skin. She tried to drop it, but her fingers wouldn't obey, as though the object had become a part of her. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. "You can't escape," the voice hissed, now coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You're ours." The ground around the massive tree began to shift, the symbols rearranging themselves into intricate patterns that spiraled inward. The fog thickened, swirling into the shape of figures. Human-like, but wrong. Their faces were indistinct, features melting like wax, but their hollow eyes glowed with the same sickly light as the carvings. Claire backed away, her pulse hammering as the figures advanced. Each step they took was deliberate, methodical, as if savoring her terror. She turned and ran, stumbling through the underbrush, her flashlight sputtering uselessly in her grip. But no matter how far she ran, the clearing seemed to pull her back. Each time she thought she had found a way out, the same massive tree loomed before her, its twisted branches clawing at the sky. "You can't leave," the voice mocked, its tone filled with dark amusement. "You were chosen." "No!" Claire screamed, her voice breaking. "I don't belong here." The forest seemed to shudder in response, its trees groaning and creaking as though alive. The fog thickened, wrapping around her like icy tendrils, pulling her closer to the tree. She thrashed against it, clawing at the ground, but the force was too strong. Her body was dragged toward the center of the clearing, her nails scraping against the dirt as she fought to resist. At the base of the tree, the doppelganger appeared again, more solid than before. Its hollow eyes burned brighter, and its smile stretched impossibly wide. It knelt beside her as she was pulled closer, tilting its head with an eerie curiosity. "Why fight?" it whispered, its voice a perfect echo of her own. "You're already home." Claire's heart pounded as the fog swirled around her, tightening its grip. The charm in her hand flared one last time, a desperate burst of light that sent the doppelganger recoiling. The glowing figures faltered, their forms flickering like a dying flame. But the light quickly faded, and the forest roared with fury. The ground beneath her split open, revealing a chasm of darkness that seemed to breathe, pulling her in. Claire screamed, clawing at the edges, but the forest wouldn't relent. The last thing she saw was the doppelganger standing over her, its smile unbroken. "You're mine now." Claire's scream echoed into the void as she plunged into the chasm. The air around her was icy and thick, suffocating her as she fell. The whispers followed her, louder and more chaotic, their sinister words weaving into her mind. She clutched the charm tightly, its faint warmth her only connection to something resembling hope, even as the darkness consumed her. Then, suddenly, she stopped falling. The impact never came. Instead, Claire found herself standing in an otherworldly landscape, a distorted version of the forest above. The trees were skeletal, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes that clawed at the sky. The air was heavy with fog, but it didn't feel like mist. It clung to her skin, crawling like unseen insects. The ground beneath her feet was damp and soft, pulsing faintly as though alive. The whispers were everywhere now, no longer distant but close, pressing against her ears like cruel secrets. As she staggered forward, she saw the symbols again, glowing faintly in the darkness, carved into every surface. Trees, rocks, even the ground itself. They seemed to hum with an energy that vibrated in her bones, urging her deeper into this nightmare. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The forest answered with a low growl that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Shapes began to move in the fog, shadowy figures with glowing eyes, their forms indistinct but unmistakably menacing. They didn't approach, but their presence surrounded her, suffocating her with their silent vigil. Then she saw it. It loomed in the distance, impossibly large, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. At its base stood the doppelganger waiting. Its form was more defined now, its face no longer a distorted reflection, but an exact replica of her own. The hollow eyes burned with a malevolent light, and the smile it wore was sharper, crueler. "You've finally arrived," it said, its voice smooth and cold. "I told you this place doesn't let go." Claire's legs buckled beneath her as despair flooded her body. The charm in her hand was dim now, its light almost extinguished. She felt its warmth fading, and with it, her strength. The doppelganger stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, savoring her fear. "What do you want?" she choked out. tears streaming down her face. It knelt beside her, its grin widening. You've been chosen, Claire. You'll stay here with us. Forever. No, she screamed, lunging backward, but the fog tightened around her, rooting her to the spot. The figures in the mist began to move closer, their forms solidifying, their glowing eyes fixed on her. The doppelganger reached out, its hand hovering over the charm in her grip. "It's time," it whispered, its voice a sinister lullaby. "Give it to me." Claire fought, clinging to the charm with every ounce of strength she had left. But the shadows closed in, and the light in her palm flickered once, twice, and then darkness. The last thing she heard was the forest, its voice a chorus of triumph. "You belong to us." Claire awoke to the sound of whispers, soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but they grew louder, their overlapping voices forming a sinister melody. Her body felt heavy, her limbs numb, as though she were submerged in the thick, oppressive air of the forest. Slowly, she opened her eyes. She was back in the clearing. The twisted tree loomed above her, its branches casting skeletal shadows over her body. The symbols on the ground glowed faintly, pulsing like the heartbeat of some ancient, malevolent force. The fog that had once wrapped around her was gone, replaced by a suffocating stillness. For a moment, Claire dared to hope that it had all been a nightmare, that she was free. But then she saw her reflection. It stood across the clearing, more real than ever, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. The doppelganger was no longer a distorted figure of smoke and shadow. It was flesh and blood, a perfect replica. It smiled at her, a cruel, triumphant curve of its lips that sent a shiver down her spine. "Why fight it?" it said, its voice an eerie echo of her own. "You're part of this place now. You always were." Claire scrambled to her feet, the charm still clutched tightly in her hand. Its light was faint, a dying ember, but it was enough to keep the doppelganger from advancing. "I'm not yours," she said through gritted teeth, her voice trembling but defiant. The doppelganger tilted its head, its smile fading into something more sinister. The forest doesn't let go of what it claims." As it spoke, the ground beneath Claire began to tremble, the symbols glowing brighter. The air around her grew colder, and the sound of cracking wood echoed through the clearing. Shadows emerged from the tree line, silent, hollow-eyed figures with faces like melted wax. They surrounded her, their movements slow but deliberate, closing the circle tighter with each step. Claire's heart pounded as she spun in place, searching for a way out. Her gaze landed on the charm. Its light flickered weakly, but it was all she had. "You want this?" she shouted, holding it high. "Take it!" The doppelganger's eyes narrowed, its expression momentarily flickering with something that resembled fear. The figures stopped, their glowing eyes fixed on the charm. Claire didn't hesitate. She hurled the charm into the center of the glowing symbols at the base of the tree. The ground erupted with light, a brilliant flash that sent the shadows recoiling and the doppelganger shrieking in rage. The force knocked Claire to the ground as the forest seemed to roar in protest. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The figures were gone. The tree stood still, its twisted branches bare. Claire sat up, trembling, her breath ragged. But as she looked at her hands, her stomach dropped. The symbols were etched into her skin, glowing faintly. The forest had marked her. She was free to leave, but it would never truly let her go. Claire stumbled out of the forest as the first light of dawn painted the horizon in pale hues of pink and gray. The trees seemed to watch her go, their twisted branches reaching but no longer restraining her. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what she'd experienced pressing down on her chest. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an unnatural silence that lingered even as the world around her seemed to awaken. Her RV was still parked where she'd left it, but it looked different. Older, weathered, as though it had been abandoned for years. The scratches on its side were deeper now, more defined, and the symbols etched into the metal seemed to pulse faintly, mirroring the glowing marks on her hands. She climbed inside, locking the door behind her, and collapsed into the driver's seat. For a moment, she sat in stunned silence, staring at her trembling hands. The carvings glowed faintly, their intricate patterns shifting just beneath her skin. No matter how hard she scrubbed, no matter how she tried to will them away, they wouldn't fade. They were a part of her now. Permanent reminder that she had been touched by the forest. The engine sputtered to life on the first try, a cruel contrast to the chaos of the night before. As she drove away, the forest loomed in the rearview mirror, its trees blending into an impenetrable wall of shadows. Claire didn't dare look back for long. She kept her eyes on the road, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. But the forest hadn't truly let her go. As the miles rolled by, the air inside the RV grew colder. The faint scent of damp earth and decay lingered, clinging to her clothes and hair. She turned the heater on full blast, but the chill remained, seeping into her bones. The glowing marks on her hands throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a constant reminder of what she had left behind, or what had followed her. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, barely louder than the hum of the engine, but they grew steadily. Claire's grip tightened on the wheel as her breath quickened. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not real. You're not real." But they were. The shadows in the corners of the RV seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that shouldn't exist. In the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of something. A face, pale and hollow-eyed, staring at her from the back of the RV. She slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding as she spun around, but the space was empty. Her chest heaved as the whispers turned to mocking laughter, low and guttural, echoing all around her. The charm was gone, but its curse remained. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but Claire knew the truth now. The forest wasn't behind her. It was inside her. The highway stretched before Claire, winding through the rolling hills of Missouri, but she no longer felt like she was moving forward. Each mile felt like running in place, the scenery blending into a monotonous blur of trees and asphalt. The whispers ebbed and flowed, a haunting symphony that seemed to echo from the walls of her RV, growing louder when she tried to ignore them. Her hands clenched the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The glowing symbols etched into her skin pulsed faintly, a constant reminder that she hadn't truly escaped. They were warm now, almost comforting, as if mocking her attempts to distance herself from the forest. She glanced at them, her stomach twisting. She could feel it in her bones. The forest's grip wasn't physical anymore. It was deeper, woven into the fabric of her being. Claire pulled over to the side of the road, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't drive like this, not with the shadows moving in the corners of her vision, not with the whispers filling her ears. Shutting off the engine, she rested her forehead against the steering wheel, willing the terror to subside. But the silence that followed was worse. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. The rearview mirror reflected not the inside of her RV, but the clearing she'd left behind. The twisted tree stood tall, its grotesque branches clawing at the foggy sky. At its base, the doppelganger stood motionless, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. Its mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but she understood them all the same. "You can't outrun us." With trembling hands, she reached for the mirror, her fingers brushing the cold glass. The reflection rippled like water, distorting for a moment before snapping back to normal. The inside of the RV returned, empty save for the haunting silence. But the fear in her chest remained. Suddenly, the engine sputtered and roared back to life on its own. The radio crackled, static filling the cabin, and then a voice, low, distorted, and far too familiar, broke through. "Why did you leave?" it whispered. Claire's heart raced as she frantically twisted the radio's knobs, trying to silence the voice, but it wouldn't stop. "You're ours, Claire," it continued, a sickening mixture of mockery and certainty. "You'll come back. They always do." "No!" she screamed, slamming her fists against the dashboard. The radio fell silent, the static cutting off abruptly, leaving her alone with the pounding of her heart. But the symbols on her hands burned hotter, their glow intensifying. Claire yanked down the sleeves of her jacket, desperate to hide them, but the heat only spread, traveling up her arms like fire beneath her skin. The RV groaned as if alive, its frame creaking in protest. The forest wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching. She could leave the trees behind, but the truth was inescapable. The forest would never leave her. Claire kept driving, though every instinct screamed for her to stop. The highway stretched endlessly, but the feeling of escape eluded her. The whispers faded, replaced by an unnerving stillness, as though the forest was giving her a moment to reflect, before it struck again. Her hands throbbed with heat, the symbols glowing brighter even beneath the sleeves of her jacket. No amount of pressure or scrubbing had dulled them. They pulsed like a second heartbeat, a sickening reminder that she was marked. She caught herself glancing at them too often, unable to ignore the sensation of something alive beneath her skin. As the road blurred under the fading daylight, the shadows inside the RV began to stretch unnaturally, twisting into jagged shapes along the walls and ceiling. Claire refused to look directly at them, afraid of what she might see. Instead, she fixed her gaze ahead, her fingers gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. But the forest had other plans. It started subtly. The road became narrower, the lines on the asphalt disappearing, replaced by a dirt path. At first, Claire thought it was a detour, but as she looked around, her stomach dropped. The trees on either side of the road had thickened, their branches arching overhead, blocking out the sky. She slammed on the brakes, the RV skidding to a stop. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. I left! But the forest didn't care. The dirt road stretched forward, leading into a darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the headlights. Claire threw the RV into reverse, but the wheels spun uselessly. The road behind her had disappeared entirely, replaced by more trees, their gnarled roots spilling across the ground like a web. Panic overtook her. She jumped out of the RV, the cool night air biting at her skin. Her flashlight flickered weakly as she shone it into the darkness, but it barely illuminated a few feet ahead. Everywhere she turned there were trees. The road, her escape, was gone. The whispers returned. This time, they came from all directions, overlapping voices that were both too close and impossibly far. They spoke her name, over and over, in tones that ranged from pleading to mocking. "Claire, why run? Come back!" She stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the damp ground. Her flashlight rolled out of her grasp, its beam landing on something carved into the nearest tree. It was her name, etched deep into the bark, surrounded by symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their tones shifting to anger. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches twisting like claws. Claire's breath hitched as she realized the forest wasn't just surrounding her, it was pulling her back. "No," she screamed, scrambling to her feet. "You can't have me!" But the glow in the carvings grew brighter, and the shadows in the RV's windows moved, forming a face, her face. The doppelganger smiled from inside the vehicle. "You were never free!" Claire's knees buckled as she stared at the reflection of her own face, her other face, smiling from inside the RV. The doppelganger's hollow eyes glowed faintly, its twisted smile an open challenge, daring her to run. But where could she go? The trees closed in tighter with each passing second, their branches tangling above her like the bars of a cage. She backed away slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers grew deafening now, a chaotic chorus of rage and triumph that echoed through her skull. Every shadow in the forest seemed to move, reaching for her, crawling closer. Her trembling hands went to the charm's absence, a phantom sensation of its weight in her palm. She had thrown it away to fight the doppelganger before, and now its protection was gone. The symbols on her skin burned brighter, their heat almost unbearable. It felt as though the forest itself was inside her, rooting her in place. From the RV, the doppelganger's voice emerged, smooth, mocking, and drenched in malice. "You've always been ours," it said, its tone soft but absolute. "There's no escape." "There never was." Claire stumbled forward, gripping the door handle of the RV with desperate force. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. She yanked the door open, only to find the vehicle empty. The shadows inside retreated, swirling like smoke into the corners. Her chest heaved as she stepped inside, her flashlight cutting weakly through the space. She turned, expecting to see the forest outside through the windshield, but there was nothing. No road, no trees, only an endless void of shifting darkness. The whispers inside her head sharpened, coalescing into a single voice, the voice of the forest itself, deep and resonant. "You belong to us, Claire. You always have." The RV jolted violently, throwing her against the wall. The entire vehicle shuddered as if alive, its frame groaning under some immense pressure. She clawed her way to the driver's seat, gripping the wheel in a futile attempt to steady herself. But the RV wouldn't respond. The lights flickered, the engine sputtered, and the shadows in the mirrors began to writhe, forming shapes. They were coming for her. "No!" Claire shouted, slamming her fists against the dashboard. "You won't take me!" But her voice was drowned out by a sudden deafening roar. Ground split open beneath the RV, a jagged chasm of darkness swallowing it whole. The air around her became a storm of whispers and shadows, pulling her down deeper into the void. The last thing Claire saw was the doppelganger standing outside the windshield, its smile serene, its eyes glowing with victory. It mouthed 3 words before the darkness consumed everything. "You are mine." Then silence. The RV, Claire, and the cursed forest became one, lost to a place where no one could ever find them again. The road ahead was empty, but the forest remained, waiting for the next traveler foolish enough to enter its grasp. The forest always wins. The highway remained empty, stretching endlessly beneath the pale morning sky. The RV was gone, consumed by the forest's insatiable hunger, and with it, Claire. The clearing where it had once sat was silent now, as if nothing had ever disturbed its sinister stillness. The forest, dark and ancient, reclaimed everything. But the story didn't end there. Miles away, in a small gas station just off a lonely road, a young clerk sat at the counter, scrolling through her phone. The monotony of her shift was interrupted by the faint sound of an engine. Looking up, she saw headlights approaching in the distance, cutting through the pre-dawn fog. The RV rolled into the lot, its once bright paint dulled and scratched, the windows opaque with grime. It stopped abruptly, its engine sputtering before falling silent. The clerk squinted, uneasy. Something about the vehicle felt wrong. She stepped out from behind the counter, cautiously approaching. The door of the RV swung open on its own, creaking loudly, and a chill breeze wafted out. "Hello," she called, her voice wavering. There was no answer. The clerk climbed the steps, peeking. The interior was dark, empty, and cold, as though no one had been there for years. Yet everything was in its place: the table, the chairs, even a notebook lying open on the small counter. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she stepped inside. The air, thick and heavy, carrying a faint scent of damp earth. Her gaze fell on the notebook. Scrawled across its pages were symbols, jagged, repeating patterns etched with almost obsessive detail. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the paper, and she froze. A word leaped out at her, written again and again, filling the pages in frantic repetition: Claire. The shadows in the RV shifted. She turned quickly, her breath hitching. The door had closed, trapping her inside. The air grew colder, the walls groaning as though the vehicle itself was alive. A faint whisper brushed against her ear, so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. Run! The clerk's heart pounded as she bolted for the door, shoving it open and tumbling out onto the pavement. She scrambled to her feet, her pulse racing, and looked back at the RV. The lights flickered once, and then it was gone. Vanished. She stood there, trembling, the notebook still clutched. In her hand, the symbols on the page seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing like a heartbeat. She dropped it and backed away, unable to tear her eyes from the empty space where the RV had been. In the weeks that followed, the clerk couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whispers came at night, faint but insistent, and the shadows in her small apartment seemed to stretch longer than they should. Somewhere deep in the forest, Claire's voice echoed, lost but never forgotten. The forest had claimed her. Now it was searching for someone else. Asterisk. The gas station clerk, Emily Harper, tried to put the strange encounter behind her. She told herself it was exhaustion, an overactive imagination, or maybe a prank. But the unease lingered. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the symbols, glowing faintly on the pages of that notebook, seared into her memory. The whispers came again that night, faint but unmistakable. They weaved through her dreams, pulling her into shadowy forests where trees loomed like ancient gods, and twisted branches clawed at the sky. She awoke drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as the faint echo of her name, Emily Sarr, lingered in the stillness of her room. The next day she told herself it was just a nightmare. She went about her routine, determined to shake the strange feeling. But things weren't the same. Her phone glitched, its screen flickering and freezing, even when fully charged. Her car wouldn't start, the engine sputtering uselessly no matter how many times she tried. Even her coworkers seemed distant, their words muddled and strange, like they were speaking through a thick fog. Then the notebook reappeared. It was sitting on the passenger seat of her car. When she finally got it running, its cover pristine despite her memory of dropping it at the gas station. Emily stared at it, her hands trembling. She hadn't taken it. She hadn't even touched it after that night, she was certain. Yet there it was, as though it had been waiting for her. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The pages were blank now, save for a single line scrawled across the center of the first page. Mark Twain National Forest. Emily's stomach twisted. She had never been there, had never even thought about it. But the words seemed to pulse on the page, drawing her gaze like a magnet. She slammed the notebook shut and shoved it into her glove compartment, her hands shaking. That night, the whispers grew louder. They followed her through her apartment, weaving into the hum of her refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, and the faint rustle of the wind outside her window. When she looked into her bathroom mirror for just a second, she thought she saw someone else staring back. Her reflection didn't smile when she did. Its hollow eyes bore into hers, filled with quiet malice. "Come," the whispers urged, louder. Now, more insistent. The next morning, Emily woke with dirt under her fingernails and scratches on her arms. She had no memory of how they got there. The notebook was on her nightstand, its cover open, the words Mark Twain National Forest glowing faintly in the dim light of dawn. She packed her bags that afternoon. As she drove toward Missouri, the symbols began to appear, not just in the notebook, but on her skin, faint and glowing, like embers waiting to ignite. The forest wasn't calling her, it was summoning her. The highway stretched ahead of Emily, endless and empty, as she drove toward the Mark Twain National Forest. Every mile felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself was thickening around her. The notebook sat on the passenger seat, its presence oppressive despite its silence. Emily refused to touch it again, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it out, either. It felt like a tether, pulling her closer to something she didn't want to face, but couldn't escape. The symbols on her skin had grown brighter. By the time she crossed the Missouri state line, they were faintly glowing, their intricate patterns visible even in the midday sun. She kept pulling her sleeves down to cover them, but the heat they radiated made it impossible to ignore them. The whispers were with her now, constant and unnerving, like a distant radio signal just beyond her comprehension. They weren't just in her ears, they were in her head, wrapping around her thoughts, drowning out her own voice. She could make out fragments of words now, though their meaning was just out of reach. Still, one message was clear: she had to keep going. By the time she reached the outskirts of the forest, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, bathing the trees in a crimson light. The sight filled her with dread. The forest looked alive, its dense canopy shifting in the wind as if it were breathing. She parked her car on the side of the road, staring into the endless expanse of trees, her heart pounding. The notebook flipped open on its own. Emily gasped, the movement unnatural and deliberate. The pages turned slowly, as if guided by an unseen hand, until they stopped at a single page. The symbols she had seen before were gone, replaced by one line scrawled across the center. "You are here." Her hands trembled as she slammed the notebook shut, her chest heaving. The forest seemed to stretch toward her now, its shadows growing longer and darker. The air grew colder, and the whispers in her head became louder, clearer. "Come," they urged. "We've been waiting." Her car wouldn't start when she turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent, just as Claire's had done. Emily cursed under her breath, slamming her hands against the steering wheel. But deep down, she wasn't surprised. She knew this was exactly what the forest wanted. With no other choice, she grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. The path into the forest seemed to open for her, a narrow trail flanked by trees that loomed like sentinels. As she stepped into the darkness, the whispers grew louder, overlapping in an eerie chant. Her flashlight flickered, its beam barely piercing the thick shadows. The symbols on her skin flared to life, glowing brighter than ever, guiding her deeper into the unknown. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed Claire. Emily moved deeper into the forest, her footsteps muffled by the soft, damp ground. The trail seemed alive, shifting beneath her with every step, as though the forest itself was guiding her. The light from her flashlight flickered erratically, barely cutting through the dense shadows. The deeper she went, the more suffocating the air became, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rot. The whispers surrounded her now, a chorus of voices that grew louder with every step. They overlapped, some pleading, others mocking, but all of them urging her forward. She couldn't stop even if she wanted to. The symbols on her arms burned brightly, casting an eerie glow on her surroundings. They weren't just guiding her, they were pulling her. The trail ended abruptly, opening into a clearing that felt disturbingly familiar. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the sight before her. The tree. It towered in the center of the clearing, its twisted branches reaching skyward like skeletal arms. The bark was dark and gnarled, etched with the same glowing symbols that burned on her skin. The air around it was colder, sharper, and carried the faint sound of whispers that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. At its base, the ground was scarred with intricate carvings that pulsed faintly with light, forming a circle that seemed to hum with energy. And then she saw her Claire, or at least what was left of her. She stood near the tree, her skin pale and marked with the same glowing symbols, her hollow eyes fixed on Emily. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, as though she were being controlled by invisible strings. Her lips curled into a faint, eerie smile. "Emily," Claire said, her voice soft but unnervingly clear. "You came." Emily's flashlight slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground as she stumbled backward. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not real. You can't be." Claire took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "I didn't want this," she said, her voice trembling with something that sounded like regret. "But the forest, it doesn't let go." The whispers swelled, louder and more urgent, as shadows began to stir at the edge of the clearing. Figures emerged, their forms shifting and indistinct, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. They moved in unison, circling the tree, their presence oppressive and suffocating. "You have to join us," Claire said, her tone flat now, devoid of emotion. "It's the only way." Emily shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, I'm not like you. I can leave." Claire tilted her head, her eerie smile widening. "No one leaves." The ground beneath Emily's feet began to tremble, the symbols glowing brighter as the air filled with a low, guttural hum. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Emily screamed, the sound swallowed by the forest as the shadows closed in. The forest had claimed another. Emily's scream was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers that now filled the clearing. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with a sinister energy that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The figures surrounding the tree moved closer, their hollow eyes glowing brighter, their forms flickering between shadow and flesh. Each step they took sent a pulse through the ground, matching the burning throb of the symbols on Emily's skin. Claire stepped forward, her movements unnervingly smooth, her smile widening. "You feel it now, don't you?" she said, her voice calm and almost soothing. "The forest doesn't just hold you, it becomes you." Emily backed away, her hands trembling as she clutched at the marks on her arms, trying in vain to rub them away. The glow only intensified, spreading across her skin like wildfire. The pain was unbearable, searing into her flesh as if the forest were carving its will into her very soul. "I won't stay," Emily choked out, her voice trembling with desperation. "I'll fight it." Claire's smile faltered for the briefest moment, and something flickered in her hollow eyes, a shadow of the person she had once been. "You'll try," she said softly. "We all do." The ground beneath Emily cracked, splitting open to reveal a chasm of swirling darkness. A low, guttural hum rose from the depths, shaking the very air around her. The symbols on the tree glowed blindingly bright, their light illuminating the entire clearing. The figures stopped moving, their heads tilting in unison as if waiting for something. The whispers became a chant, low and rhythmic, their words incomprehensible but undeniably powerful. Emily stumbled, falling to her knees as the ground shifted beneath her. Her arms burned, the symbols now blazing with an intensity that lit up the night. The tree loomed above her, its branches twisting and reaching, beckoning her closer. The pull was irresistible. Emily clawed at the ground, fighting against the force dragging her forward, but it was no use. The shadows moved faster now, circling her like predators closing in on their prey. "Please," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I don't want this." Claire knelt beside her, her expression softening. For a moment she looked almost human again. "It's not about what you want," she whispered. "It's about what it wants!" The doppelganger emerged from the tree, its form solidifying as it stepped into the circle of light. Its face was hers, perfect and terrifying, its hollow eyes fixed on her with a knowing smile. "It's time," it said, its voice layered with the whispers of the forest. The ground gave way beneath Emily, and she plunged into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the doppelganger, its smile unbroken, and Claire standing beside it, her expression blank. The clearing fell silent, the forest reclaiming its peace. And somewhere, deep within the trees, a new whisper began. It was searching for the next.